Our next speaker is Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He has published 9 books as well as numerous scholarly and journalistic articles, including most recently Counterhistory of the Present, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, Radical History, and the Politics of Art. And for more information, you can follow him at gabrielrockhill.com. Thank you so much for joining us, Gabriel, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks to all of the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a brief 15-minute presentation entitled The Imperial Bourgeoisie, and I'd like to begin by just highlighting the fact that there is very little reflection, I think, on the part of the PMC stratum regarding its class standing, and that there's often a deep-seated skepticism that Noah was talking about on the part of the working class regarding certain segments of the PMC. And this can often lead to certain forms of counterproductive anti-intellectualism. In my opinion, there needs to be much more self-critical analysis of class standing, as well as a broader awareness of the role of cross-class alliances in advancing the socialist cause. Personally, I'm not speaking from the point of view of someone who's unfamiliar with the working world. I'm currently a university professor and would be classified as a member of the PMC stratum within the Imperial Core, and I think that's important to highlight. At the same time, I grew up on a farm in rural Kansas doing farm labor and working construction, and then I continued to support myself throughout my studies by continuing to work construction. And so I share this information simply because in order to indicate the fact that the things that I'll be talking about are not somehow external to my own experience. And I'm deeply familiar with the life of manual labor, as well as the forms of intellectual labor undertaken by the PMC. So the professional intellectuals in the Imperial Core are generally disconnected from the struggles of working people. While this is commonly the case on the domestic front, they're even more detached from the international working class in the global South. Unsurprisingly, then, they often take political positions that are detrimental to the working and oppressed masses of the world. The phenomenon known as Western Marxism is an excellent example, as are the various forms of Western radical or critical theory. While sometimes advancing pertinent critiques of capitalism, and in particular of subjective experiences within consumer society, these traditions have more or less systematically advocated for ABS theory, anything but socialism. They've rejected every type of socialism in the real world, unless, of course, it is a form of so-called democratic socialism that is not a serious threat to capitalism, but rather a class compromise. This means that they advocate for a BS theory, because they refuse to embrace the real material solution to the problems of capitalism, which is the difficult but necessary construction of socialism. This situation has led to an understandable skepticism on the part of many workers regarding any possible positive contribution by the professional intelligentsia, or at least those ensconced within the academy, since there is often a remarkable amount of faith placed in other segments of the intelligentsia, such as journalists and pundits interviewed in the mainstream media. In a country like the United States, such skepticism, though partially justifiable, is enhanced by the deep-seated anti-intellectualism that plagues the country's culture. For those invested in a meaningful transformation of society in an egalitarian and sustainable direction, this skepticism has often led to ultra-leftist positions that consist in maintaining that workers can and should make a revolution on their own, without the pernicious influence of professional intellectuals. In many organizing circles, including political parties, this anti-intellectualism often goes hand in hand with a form of populism that fetishizes the spontaneous thoughts and actions of workers. Such a position, I will argue, is dangerous and counterproductive. In What is to be Done, Lenin clearly stated that bourgeois theorists are not only helpful to making a revolution, insofar as they are capable of providing a theoretical map of the social totality and how to transform it. They are actually necessary for revolution, and it is naive and short-sighted to rely on spontaneous workers' consciousness. Quote, this is from Lenin's What is to be Done. All those who talk about exaggerating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious elements, etc., imagine that the pure and simple labor movement can work out an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers take their fate out of the hands of the leaders. This, Lenin says, is a profound mistake, end quote. The peerless leader of the Russian Revolution thereby took a categorical position that cuts directly against the grain of the ultra-leftist celebration of autonomous and spontaneous worker struggles as capable of leading directly to socialist revolution, as well as against the widespread anti-intellectualism that plagues a country like the US. There are many reasons for Lenin taking this position, but I'd like to simply highlight two. The first is that he insightfully elucidated why the spontaneous consciousness of workers tends to be trade unionism, insofar as they gravitate toward political positions that serve their personal economic interests, such as increases in wages, shorter work weeks, more benefits, and so forth. Moreover, within the imperial core, workers have often engaged in social chauvinism by ignoring the plight of workers in the colonial and semi-colonial periphery, while aligning themselves on the interests of their national bourgeoisies. This means that spontaneous workers' consciousness tends to remain within bourgeois ideology, insofar as they are trained within the capitalist system to look out for their own material interests and to preserve their position atop the imperial pyramid. Second, Lenin maintained that the power of Marxist theory consists, among other things, in the ability to move from the level of subjective experience to an objective analysis of the social totality. It is capable of explaining why the subjective ideology of workers is the result of objective social forces, if it be the subjectivism that pervades capitalist ideology or the social chauvinism that results from imperialist socio-economic relations. It can, in other words, concretely abstract from the immediacy of personal experience in order to elucidate the system of relations that produces that experience in the first place. Since spontaneous thought and action within capitalism are necessarily subordinated to bourgeois ideology, this form of objective analysis that you get in Marxist theory can contribute to the development of socialist ideology. This, very precisely, is the role of the bourgeois intelligentsia, according to Lenin, and he cites Kautsky and uses the term bourgeois intelligentsia. On the basis of profound scientific knowledge, it produces the ideology of socialism, which does not naturally or organically arise within the working class. Now, this does not mean, as Lenin clarifies in a very important footnote, that, quote, the workers have no part in creating such an ideology, end quote. But they do so not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians who are capable of acquiring the knowledge of their age and advancing that knowledge. I'd like to shift now to the question of the imperial petty bourgeoisie and the intellectual labor aristocracy. So the PMC stratum in the imperial core is not only situated above the working class domestically, it is also positioned at the apex of an international pyramid, both economically and ideologically. In the case of professional intellectuals, those intellectuals beneath them domestically or in the imperial pyramid are generally obliged to subordinate themselves to their dictates. There is thus an intellectual labor aristocracy, just like there is a manual labor aristocracy, although the former is elevated both economically and ideologically. So the intellectual labor aristocracy serves as global power brokers in the realm of ideas. To take a recent example, major figures in the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which has been a core contributor to the legacy of Western Marxism, have taken strong public positions on the question of Palestine. Jürgen Habermas and Rainer Forst co-authored with others a text entitled Principles of Sovereignty, in which they wrote, quote, despite all the concern for the fate of the Palestinian population, the standards of judgment slip completely when genocidal intentions are attributed to Israel's actions, end quote. In perfect line with the dominant ideology in the imperial core, they suggest that attributing genocidal intentions to the Israeli government would inexorably lead to anti-Semitism, as if the anti-imperialist critique of the state of Israel could only be understood through a culturalist lens as a condemnation of all Jewish people. This anti-Marxist, culturalist form of identitarian thinking means, in short, that there simply is no space for an anti-imperialist critique of the Israeli state. It is foreclosed as anti-Semitic. Moreover, the authors, Habermas and Forst, leave out of their discussion the patent fact that many members of the Israeli leadership have clearly and repeatedly stated their genocidal intentions, and their words have been fully backed up by their deeds. At this point, at least 17,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and about 1.9 million have been displaced, according to the UN. To put this in perspective, these numbers now surpass the 1948 Nakba, when some 15,000 people were killed and 800,000 displaced. Shaya Benhabib, a political science professor at Yale University, has taken a very similar position. I'm going to jump over this material in the interest of time, but she basically says that we can't look at the conflict in Palestine uniquely through a settler colonial lens, and plays the petty bourgeois card of it's more complicated, meaning it's more complicated than imperialism. And there's an excellent article by Muhammad Ali Khalidi that goes after her on this front, and also points out a number of the disingenuous mischaracterizations that are in her article. So when world famous professional intellectuals like Shaya Benhabib, Jürgen Habermas, and others of their ilk reprimand those critical of Israel's settler colonial project and recent genocidal assault, made possible, of course, by imperialist countries that support Israel, and especially the United States, they are exercising their power as members of the intellectual labor aristocracy to discipline those beneath them, both within their respective countries and internationally. They are also seeking to corral and control public opinion by exercising their so-called expertise, which is itself a product of the imperial intellectual apparatus that forged them as intellectuals. When they parrot the fundamental core of the dominant ideology of the US State Department, they are quite literally doing their job as imperialist ideologues who are perched atop an international hierarchy of knowledge production for a reason. So the petty bourgeois class stratum is itself notoriously unreliable and unstable. It works for and is subservient to the capitalist ruling class, and it generally promotes the dominant ideology, as I've just demonstrated briefly with the examples I highlighted. However, bereft of the power of its corporate overlords and beholden to their decisions, it often expresses resentment and frustration, and it sometimes presents itself as being on the side of the masses. One of the most common orientations of this latter group, those who feign to be on the side of workers, is petty bourgeois radicalism. It consists in proposing magical solutions to very real problems. This can take very different forms, but one of the most common is third-way politics that identifies the pernicious effects of capitalism, but condemns the long and difficult road to building socialism through political parties and the seizure of state power. Instead, it proffers a quote-unquote left critique of actually existing socialism and advocates for an alternative path to overcoming capitalism, the magical third way. This form of politics can take various different forms, such as the support for an insurgent disruption of the given order by spontaneous action, the immediate establishment of a direct workers' democracy, or the messianic postulation of a transcendent idea of communism to come. Whatever the case may be, these third-way proposals serve the purpose of radical recuperation. They sound radical due to their critiques of capitalism. However, since their proposed solutions are based on magical thinking, their radicality has no basis in material reality and concrete class struggles. Therefore, they actually serve to recuperate potentially radical forces within a process of capitalist accommodation. In the words of Gus Hall, quote, petty bourgeois radicalism does a very special favor to capitalism because it covers its anti-communism and anti-Sovietism with left radical phrases, end quote. Since it does not materially and concretely contribute to workers' struggles, but instead shores up the capitalist system, petty bourgeois radicalism serves first and foremost to consolidate the socioeconomic position of the professional intelligentsia within capitalism. As a form of class struggle, it struggles to maintain the class position of the professional managerial class strata. Final concluding section is on the contradiction of intellectual life under capitalism. So to develop theory, which is a necessity, as I mentioned earlier, according to Lenin, to make a socialist revolution, you need education, support, resources, time, and so on. Within capitalism, this tends to be possible primarily within the imperial intellectual apparatus, although there are, of course, some exceptions. In order to advance within that apparatus, meaning this whole system for the production of ideas, their distribution, and their consumption, you have to play by the rules of the game, at least to a certain extent. An entire system of norms and values must be respected if you want to ascend within the extant social order. These pressures and other forces tend to breed conformism. After all, the surest way to succeed in the imperial intellectual apparatus is to invest in an imperialist theoretical practice like Jürgen Habermas and Shaya Benhabib, whose fame in the system is itself indicative of their political orientation. I would like to conclude then by indicating two tactics and one overall strategy for dealing with the following contradiction. Intellectuals are capable of providing forms of objective analysis that are necessary to revolutionary transformation of society, but within the imperial intellectual apparatus, they're trained instead to contribute to imperialism, and their career advancement largely depends on the extent of their contribution, as mediated as this contribution might be. The first tactic might be referred to as Trojan horse intellectual labor. It consists in producing the appearance of work that is palatable to the extant system in some capacity, but that actually smuggles in an alternative message or does underground anonymous work. The advantage of this tactic is that it is feasible within the given system of knowledge production, and it leverages power for those who can benefit from the time, resources, and training of the capitalist system of knowledge production. The disadvantage is that it often requires extensive sacrifices and compromises and can easily remain somewhat precarious. The second tactic, and I'm going to finish here in 2-3 minutes, Carlos. The second tactic consists in cultivating worker intellectuals who have greater freedom to do counter-hegemonic theoretical research because their livelihood is not dependent upon the imperial intellectual apparatus or because they work anonymously. One of the clearest examples in the current context is the work of Norman Finkelstein and everything that he's been doing around the most recent genocidal assault against the Palestinians. He's saying things and taking positions that are directly opposed to those of Habermas and Benhabib. If he had an academic job, he could easily lose it. However, since he was already the object of a heinous campaign that left him bereft of an academic position, this simply is not possible. There are many other examples that could be pointed to, including, of course, the work of intellectuals who never had stable university positions, like Michael Parenti, as well as those who never taught in the academy at all, such as George Jackson. It is important in this regard that counter-hegemonic intellectual work often goes hand in hand with the development of an alternative apparatus of knowledge production, circulation, and reception. Such an apparatus seeks to put power in the hands of the people rather than the ownership class, thereby democratizing intellectual labor and learning. I take it that all of the three organizations that have co-sponsored this event are, in different ways, with various objectives and with very limited resources, attempting to do something along these lines. The more resources that can be leveraged in this direction, the more opportunities there will be to support the work of intellectual workers who are not ensconced in the bourgeois academy. Final words, both of these tactics can put intellectuals in the service of the socialist cause. However, the overall strategy needs to be the building of a socialist intellectual apparatus in which the educational system functions of, by, and for the people. This is not an easy task, and the establishment of a socialist country does not magically bring this about. Struggles continue after revolutions, of course, to further develop, perfect, and democratize systems of intellectual production, circulation, and reception. This can be a very long and difficult process, but it must remain the horizon of our work. Thank you very much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.